Back in ancient times, there was this powerful empire called Assyria. It started off small, just a trading community centered around the city of Ashur. But over time, it grew into the biggest empire in the ancient world, even before Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire. Now, how did they become so mighty? Well, it wasn't because they were great at paperwork or making friends. No, it was all about their skill in warfare. The Assyrians had the most efficient military force back then, until their empire fell in 612 BCE. What made them so formidable? They had a well-trained army, used iron weapons, were good at building stuff, had clever tactics, and, perhaps most importantly, they were ruthless. They didn't mess around. If a city or town resisted their rule, they didn't just politely ask them to stop. Oh no, they went in hard. Assyrian kings liked to brag about how they destroyed, devastated, and burned with fire anyone who dared to challenge them. These kings weren't joking around. They made sure everyone knew what happened to those who defied them. Imagine this. If a city rebelled, the king might flay the leaders alive, cover a pillar with their skin, and stick it up for everyone to see. Yeah, brutal stuff. But here's the thing, despite all this terror, the Assyrians weren't exactly loved. Sure, people respected and feared them, but they also hated them. There were constant rebellions against their rule. Now, why did they need such a hardcore army, you ask? Well, for starters, there were always rebellions popping up within their empire. And then you had neighboring kingdoms trying to invade their territory. So, having a standing army was pretty much essential for keeping everything in check. But here's the kicker. It wasn't until this dude named Tiglath-Pileser III came along that things really started to change. He brought some practical changes to the military that made them even more formidable. So, before Tiglath-Pileser III took the reins, the Assyrian army was already a force to be reckoned with. Way back, even during the time of Shamashi-Adad, they were showing off their military muscle. And during what they call the Middle Empire, kings like Ashurbanipal were out there conquering regions left and right. Then you had Adad-Nirari, who was all about expanding the empire through conquest and squashing rebellions. One of his big moves was conquering this place called Mitanni. And you know what he did next? He didn't just sit back and enjoy the victory. He decided to deport a bunch of people from Mitanni and settle Assyrians in their place. But hey, it wasn't all doom and gloom for the deportees. Historian Karen Rodner says they were actually treated pretty well. They were carefully chosen based on their skills and sent off to places where they could put those skills to good use. Plus, families stayed together, which was a relief. But if you were one of those folks who put up a fight against the Assyrians, well, things didn't end so well for you. You either got killed or sold into slavery. Brutal, right? Anyway, this whole deportation and assimilation thing became standard policy for the Assyrians. Fast forward a bit to Tiglath-Pileser I, who took the military to the next level. He expanded the empire even more, which is pretty impressive considering he didn't have a full-time army at his disposal. See, back then, armies were made up of part-time soldiers who were mostly farmers. So, wars happened during the summer, between planting and harvest seasons. But then Tiglath-Pileser III showed up and changed the game completely. He was like, you know what? Let's make this army thing a full-time gig. And just like that, he created the world's first professional military. So, Tiglath-Pileser III wasn't messing around when he decided to revamp the Assyrian army. He was like, from now on, we're going pro. He started recruiting and training soldiers full-time, and he made sure they had the best weapons, like iron swords and spears, and some seriously cool war chariots. Once his army was ready to roll, Tiglath-Pileser III wasted no time. First, he headed north and took down the kingdom of Urartu in 743 BCE. Then, he marched west into Syria and showed no mercy to the kingdom of Arpad in 741 BCE. He laid siege to the city for 3 whole years, and when it finally fell, he didn't hold back. He destroyed the city and made sure anyone left alive was deported to other regions. And let me tell you, these campaigns weren't easy. They required a top-notch army like the one Tiglath-Pileser III had built. With their iron weapons and advanced tactics, they were a force to be reckoned with. But it wasn't just about having fancy weapons, it was about strategy too. Tiglath-Pileser III knew how to plan his battles and make sure he came out on top. Imagine being on the other side, facing off against the Assyrian army. You'd see rows of infantry, armed to the teeth with iron weapons, marching with precision and discipline. And let's not forget about their archers and slingers, raining down arrows and stones from a distance. Plus, they had these badass war chariots, pulled by horses instead of slow old donkeys. By 736 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III had expanded the Assyrian Empire across Mesopotamia and the Levant, basically dominating everything from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. And when he passed the torch to his son Sargontu, he was handing over not just an empire, but the most formidable army the ancient world had ever seen. Alright, so let's talk about the Neo-Assyrian army and their siege warfare tactics. These guys were masters at laying siege to heavily fortified cities, and they had some serious firepower at their disposal. They even had a separate corps of engineers solely dedicated to siege warfare, which was pretty cutting-edge stuff back then. When they laid siege to a city like Lachish, they didn't mess around. First, they'd surround the place to prevent anyone from escaping. Then, they'd start peppering the city walls with archers, all while shielding themselves with giant shields. Meanwhile, they'd be building these massive earthen ramps right up against the walls, getting ready to wheel in their siege towers with battering rams. Once everything was in place, they'd launch a full-on assault. The tower would roll up the ramp, while the battering ram pounded away at the walls. Archers in the tower would clear the way for infantry armed with scaling ladders to climb up and join the fight. It was intense, and it could take days, but eventually, they'd breach the city. And when they got in, it wasn't pretty. The place would be looted, and anyone left alive would be put to the sword. Some unlucky souls might even end up impaled on stakes as a warning to others. One of the most famous sieges in Assyrian history was the siege of Lachish under Sennacherib. Even today, you can still see the earthen ramp they built to attack the city. Archaeologists have found tons of artifacts from the siege, including arrowheads and weaponry. But the Assyrians weren't just about brute force. They also used terror as a weapon. By sacking cities and leaving them in ruins, they sent a clear message to anyone else thinking about resisting them. Even after Sennacherib, his successors like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal kept up the same brutal tactics. Ashurbanipal, in particular, was known for his vengeance. He completely destroyed the city of Susa, leaving it in ruins and scattering the bones of its kings. But here's the thing, while all this destruction might have seemed like a good idea at the time, it eventually came back to bite them. The Persians, taking advantage of the chaos left behind by the Assyrians, slowly but surely started to take over their territory. So, after Ashurbanipal's reign, things took a turn for the worse. His sons, Ashur-etlilani and Sin-shar-ishkun, didn't quite live up to their old man's legacy. In fact, they were too busy fighting each other for control of the empire to notice it slipping through their fingers. When Ashurbanipal passed away in 627 BCE, his empire was already on shaky ground. The civil war between his sons drained whatever resources the empire had left, leaving it vulnerable to revolt. And revolt is exactly what happened. The Assyrian Empire had ruled with an iron fist for centuries, but its subjects had had enough. Former vassal states rose up against their oppressors, taking advantage of the power struggle within the royal family. With no strong leader to hold the empire together, it was only a matter of time before it crumbled. City after city fell to the rebellion, including the once great Assyrian strongholds of Ashur, Kalhu, and Nineveh. The end of the Assyrian Empire marked the end of an era. Their glorious history, chronicled in clay tablets and vast libraries, was buried beneath the rubble of their cities. But their military legacy lived on. The Assyrians may have been defeated, but their military technology and tactics left a lasting impression on the civilizations that came after them. The Romans, in particular, took a page out of the Assyrian playbook, adopting their siege engines and ruthless tactics. So, while the Assyrian Empire may have fallen, their influence lived on in the armies of those who succeeded them.